Hi, everyone, and welcome back into the Comics Lair. We are sponsored by Heroes Aren't Hard to Find and Heroes Convention. I'm your host, Nancy Northcott. This panel will discuss the different worlds of Marvel's X-Men. And I'll start by asking the panel to tell us briefly a little bit about their interest in X-Men. And David, would you like to start?
My interest in X-Men is what drew me to it was the international team, the team I have behind me. That's what hooked me when they went into the giant size and went into the next phase, and I was never able to leave it alone after that. Also, the X-Men are the hardest allegory team in comics. Okay, Marvel heroes are based on regular people with a problem, and getting powers didn't solve the problem. X-Men became an allegory for every outcast group in society you might want to think of. I don't know if that was the intent, but that's how they develop now. And so their adventures are always allegorical. It's never just about the adventure. It's about, depending on where you are in life, can you relate to that? And so we always find that very interesting. Not that we always agree on every direction, but it always has something that you can relate to. And that's incredible for all these years for them to still have that power.
Okay, Darryl?
I think for the most part, David is 100% on that one. They are great for allegory in general. I'm a big fan of team books. Like I love X-Men, I love Avengers, I love Justice League. I love seeing how people use all their different various powers to come to, a conclusion on something. It's not just like one punch, one kick. It's this can mix with this, and that's how you get like the fastball special, right? As far as allegory, I think they've kind of gotten away from that, or at least there was a period where it just became less allegory and more how much suffering can we put the X-Men through? And I wasn't not a big, huge fan of it. Every time these guys just try to leave well enough alone and find their own pieces, someone's coming up to ruin the day. So I'm always a big fan of huge teams, and the cartoon hit at the perfect age for me.
Okay, Marisa?
Yes, I was like, yes, listening. So I first got into X-Men. I went to the comic book store with my dad. I'm a second-gen nerd. And I think it was Excalibur. I don't think it was Uncanny X-Men, but there was a dragon on the cover, and I was like, oh yeah, comic books, dragons, I'm in, let's do this. And so I was of the exact right age to fall desperately in love with Kitty Pryde and her dragon. And then you can't read Excalibur and not read every X-Men comic. So I immediately got into Uncanny and X-Men, and I don't know, probably 8 astonishing X-Men. It just kept going. And my dad was delighted. So that was really fun. Then the cartoon came a couple years after that. And I loved there's so many stories I don't know. And they would hint at, like, Kitty had lost her best friend, and I didn't know what that was about. And her and Colossus had broken up. And so I was reading old back issues. And then I found the Phoenix. Oof, yeah. So there was always more to learn. And as a very nerdy child who read really fast, having endless back issues felt just like luxurious. So,
okay, Van?
Well, as an Avengers guy from 76, 77, the X-Men were always that other thing that wasn't DC, but didn't really feel like Marvel to me. It felt like its own universe in a lot of ways, where different rules applied than applied in the other Marvel comics I read. Like, for example, in other comics, if you're a superhero, you're a celebrity, like the Fantastic Four. But in the X-Men, you're hated and feared. I'm like, how is that the same universe? But anyway, I came in 111 when they'd all been brainwashed into thinking that they were somebody else and were working at a carnival and had different costumes. And so I was so confused because the first issue, they had one name and one costume. And then the second issue, they totally looked different. They had different costumes, different names. And so I got off to a very rocky start with the X-Men, but I've followed them peripherally ever since, on and off, and certainly through all the movies and all that. So they're not my favorite thing, but I appreciate them, and certainly the things that Claremont and Byrne did back in the day, especially in Dave Cockrum, I have very high regard for.
Okay. Mike?
Yeah. I started reading X-Men when I started reading comics. My uncle had just come back from overseas, and he started collecting comics back in the 70s. And he had a pretty extensive collection by the time I saw him. And I visited him once, and he had a graphic novel, God Loves, Man Kills, and I started reading it. And as a kid, growing up in the inner city, it really connected with me. It was heartbreaking. It was the first time that I'd had a connection with comics, and the pages broke my heart. But I was hooked. The X-Men really connected with me as the first experience I ever had with comics. So since then, I keep that feeling with me every time I open a new page, to remind me that how deeply connected to these characters that I am. And it just all spread out from there. From there, it was Spider-Man, the gritty one-off stories from Spider-Man. And then, of course, I expanded out to Avengers, and ultimately the entire universe became a place where I could get away from how the world was around me at the time. And the love just built, it grew from there. So X-Men always have a special place in my heart.
Kat?
For me, the X-Men, I came to them as a teen, at I think around the time that Kitty Pryde and the Dazzler were first appearing on the scene. And I think that they really spoke to me and to every kind of geeky, smart kid, because the X-Men read more kind of like teen/YA than the other superheroes do. And so I think for teens who feel like outsiders, there's a kind of profound identification there. And I feel as though Phoenix and Jean Grey, who's been a kind of like gone through so many permutations, but like the Dark Phoenix saga, which we were just talking about a little before the panel, has so much to say about women and anger. And I think particularly I came out of a generation where women were not supposed to be angry, and we still are not supposed to be angry, depending on who you're talking to. And I think, kind of that vision of a woman capable of destroying worlds with her anger is a very compelling one.
Okay. Jim?
Well, I came to it, I think the comics, really, I came to it late teens. I might have even been in college when I really started getting into them, because I had a friend down the hall that had a lot of them. And so it was kind of sporadic as to which ones I saw, because it was not, it was one of those things that I was interested in, but I was also interested in a lot of other stuff too. So it was one of those things I'd catch sporadically. And then when the cartoon hit, it was one of those things to watch, and it was always one of those things that was fun to me. But the couple of ideas that always struck me as different, that really kind of kept pulling me back, was a couple of things. Number one, the idea that recognition of education was really important. It wasn't just, okay, you're standing alone. It was really that idea of, okay, you have a lot of power, you have a lot of responsibility. And, oh, by the way, we're going to teach you something about how to do that. And then we're going to tap some of you guys, because now you need to go meet that higher calling. And that was kind of the way I always pictured that. But the other thing was that you always had some flexibility there, because of that of, well, somebody's off this way, but we can pull somebody new in. And sometimes you would get that person you needed when they needed to be there. And often it was that, what do you get out of when you change things up? It wasn't always the same team, even inside of the team, because you could tap people in the school. And that was one of those things that I always found really interesting, plus the balance against the politics. And this idea of, you're not sitting, it's not you're the great heroes. It was, they were trying to balance, are they heroes? Are they villains? And it really was we're just trying to get through the day, and we have, in some cases, really extraordinary capabilities and powers and things like that, that you really don't necessarily know how to control them. And you're around a lot of other people that are the exact same way. And that made for a lot of internal conflict that then could also be faced out. And that was the stuff that I thought allowed them to address a lot of really sensitive topics, especially for the time.
Well, I'm probably the Jane came lately to the X-Men on this panel, because I was in my 20s when Giant Size X-Men #1 came out. And that was the first X-Men story I actually read. And it was gorgeous. I mean, it was written by Len Wein and drawn by Dave Cockrum. And I mean, show me something Dave Cockrum drew that's not gorgeous. I mean, I defy you to do it. And then when the series went on with Chris Claremont and John Byrne, I got sucked into it because I'm a real sucker for found family. The Legion of Superheroes, the Teen Titans, not so much the Justice League, although some people think that they are. They don't ring that bell for me, but the X-Men did. I mean, they do all this stuff together. They live together. They bicker like relatives sometimes. And I was enjoying it. And then came the start of the whole Phoenix thing. And we'll talk about that in more detail in a little bit. But that was interesting because here's this woman who she can read minds, and she's a telepath. Telepaths are useful. Saturn Girl and the Legion of Superheroes is one of my favorites. But then all of a sudden she got amped up, and that was interesting. So it's mostly the found family aspect, and of course the adventures and just the beautiful look of the book that really kind of pulled me into it. And so as we were discussing before the panel started, there are like 17,010 different X-Men titles. So in order not to be here until next year, we're just going to let everybody talk about what their favorite ones are and why. So, you know, if you have like 7 favorites, please pick 1 or 2 and talk about those. And Darryl, let's start with you.
Strangely enough, my favorite era is now. I am a huge Jonathan Hickman fan. He is my favorite writer of comics. So he gave us what I think is a perfect Avengers run. He gave us what I think is a perfect Secret Wars. And then he disappeared from Marvel for a couple of years. And I just remember, like, it's that weird, like, you remember where you were when you found out JFK was shot? I remember where I was when I found out that Hickman was coming back to Marvel and coming back to the X-Men. And it was just like a weird level of hype, like Big Brain is coming back to play in a sandbox that has been relatively ignored for the last 2 decades and some change. And the what he came with his typical Hickman charts and graphs and way over explaining nonsense. It's still campy, it's still soap opera-ish, but I definitely love it. And you know, it's not a new idea. The idea of let's all just kind of live on our own and tend to our own business. But just the little aspects and the spins he puts on things just made it so much interesting to me. And, you know, the goods they have to barter with the outside world that gives them a new position of bargaining and a position of power. And all right, well, the countries that don't work with us publicly, well, maybe we can work with them a little bit in the shadows too. And that's how you get a couple of spinoff series. And I just love everything that they've been doing with this new modern House of X, Powers of 10, Dawn of X run, Reign of X.
Okay, Marisa?
Man. Okay. One, because I had left for a while I was teaching. I did not have the bandwidth or the budget for comics while I was a teacher. So I came to Phoenix End Song really late. It was already a graphic novel. It wasn't a run anymore. But I loved it. So it was Jean Grey is dead. She'd been dead. Cyclops is with White Queen, which I was not prepared for. But so I was reading it, and it was beautiful. I mean, it was beautifully illustrated. It was beautifully written. But it was giving Jean Grey all the agency that I felt like sometimes she didn't get, especially like the whole Dark Phoenix thing. Like, just kidding. It wasn't her. She'd never be evil. And I was like, she'd be evil if she wants to. But in End Song, it was like through the lens of a bunch of other characters, you got to see Jean Grey make her choice and her peace, and the fact that this cosmic power like genuinely wanted her for all of her flaws and all of her entire humanness. And then it also made me go buy comics again for a while, because I was like, wait, Cyclops is with Emma Frost? What have I missed over these last 4 years? So it was also just a great hook, because I think the only thing I had read between like late 90s and those early 2000s was Neil Gaiman's 1642, which I hope we get to talk about. But I read that and I loved it, but it was a very self-contained little thing, so it didn't make me go rebuy everything.
Okay, Van?
For everything that's come along since, I think that probably my favorite X-Men anything were those first couple of years after I started reading it. And I know a lot of people will say, well, our favorite anything is when we first discover it, but that's not necessarily true for some things that I like. But in terms of the X-Men, I came in just as Claremont was getting going and John Byrne was getting going with him, and they were co-plotting together, and they were really doing stuff that they were doing stuff that was not what you would see in other comics of that day. And it wasn't, to me, vastly superior, but it was so different and so well done that I still wanted to know about it. I still wanted to be in on it, right? I mean, this is the whole period leading up to Dark Phoenix, all the stuff with everything from Magneto, the first big Magneto story of that era, to Arcade's Murder World, and the first appearance of Alpha Flight and Vindicator, all that, the trip to Japan, Moses Magnum, and then back through Canada and all that. And it just had this feel to it. When the Avengers would do stuff like this, it felt like the Marines landing in Normandy. You're like, they're going to roll in and it's just a big time. Here comes the varsity to kick butt. When the X-Men would do these things, I would be reading it going, they're all going to die. I never had the feeling the Avengers were going to die. The whole planet could be about to be destroyed. And I'd be like, oh, the Avengers will fix this. But with the X-Men, I don't know what it was about the way that Claremont wrote them and the way that Byrne drew them, but I had a perpetual sense of, good God, this could be the last issue. They could all die. And I've never quite understood what they were doing that gave me that sense, but it just felt like they were younger. They were not as powerful in a way. They had a lot of vulnerabilities. They kind of leaned on each other emotionally in ways that the other superheroes didn't. And that was all very interesting to me. And you mentioned, Nancy, Dave Cockrum. Not only was he a great artist prior to and then later on, but he's the guy he's the costume designer at Marvel, for a long period there. And he designed a lot of those classic costumes that are behind David, for example, right now. And plus he also designed the classic Ms. Marvel costume from the 80s, late 70s and 80s that to me is the greatest costume in comics. So they just were very fortunate to have some of the absolute top-notch creative people working on that title. And by the way, that's a strange phenomenon, because just a couple of years earlier, it had almost been canceled. It was doing reprints of the Stan Lee issues, and there was serious thought that X-Men was a failed experiment that was going to go nowhere. And then all of a sudden, you just happen to get Claremont and Byrne on there and Cockrum, and it takes off. So, sometimes, and I always think it's funny that, kind of the inside joke about the X-Men is that they really, in a way, exist because Stan got tired of making up radioactive something story origins. There was the radioactive barrel of waste that hit Daredevil. There's the radioactive spider that bit Spider-Man. And so Stan's like, I'm just going to say they all were born with their powers. There we go, done. Don't have to think up any radioactive beetles or any radioactive airplane crashes into them or anything. They're just born with it. The end. So it was kind of a contrived thing from the start, but it just shows you can take any property and put the right talented people on it and make something truly amazing and phenomenal out of it.
Mike?
Yeah, I have to say, like Van was saying, though, the origin, the first time I read X-Men stays with me, but I have to say my absolute favorite was probably the Jim Lee Claremont run. That felt like X-Men #1. That felt like a renaissance of the X-Men. It felt like they were grown-ups. That run felt like they had matured to a solid team, right up there. I mean, they had always had the respect of the other super teams to an extent, but at that point, when Magneto came back and they stepped up and they created the blue and gold teams, that's when I think for me that they came into their own. That was probably my favorite run. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before, and Jim Lee's artwork was just incredible for the time.
Okay, Kat?
Well, I got to, shout out to the Chris Claremont and John Byrne run, which is just so terrific. And I had forgotten Neil Gaiman's 1642 until Marisa mentioned that, and that was a genuine joy. And I have also enjoyed some of the stuff that Seanan McGuire has been doing with the X-Men, X-Men Gold and X-Men Black. And I wanted to point to Kat Valente's got a book called Refrigerator Diaries, one chapter of which is a Jean Grey character speaking, which I heartily recommend. Just absolutely phenomenal. It kind of speaks to a lot of the, oh God, here's Jean Grey. Yeah, it's called the Refrigerator Diaries. And if you like superheroes, it is just brilliant. So that's one of my X-Men that's kind of not X-Men.
Okay, Jim?
One of the ones that really sticks with me is the Noir series, when they did those couple of limited runs, because you got to see the same kind of aspects and personalities, but what would happen if they were steered in a different direction? And the idea of, hey, sociopathy is the next generation. Looking and saying, okay, well, these powers can be used. And that idea of Xavier coming out and saying, well, no, you really should be the superior life form. That flip on the tropes. You don't have Magneto coming and saying, we're the next generation of humans. We need to seize that power. It was that you had just that very dark feel to it. And it was that what if, that what if you have a different guide and a different person for these powers and these personalities, which way would it go? Especially if it happens in a time and an age where you didn't necessarily even have the technology that would balance out some of that kind of power. And that was one of those things to me that really was interesting, seeing those characters played not only in the different time, but such a different way and different motivation, and seeing how could they go if they had not gotten the guidance that they did. And that was one of those things that to me was an interesting run, even though I don't necessarily know you would consider it traditional X-Men, but it to me, it still had that same heart, that same feel. It was just, which way are they going to go? And that to me was one of the big things. When you see Jean Grey killed in that series, that was one of those things that you're like, oh, okay.
Okay, David?
I have to say Lonnie Cochran, but I also have to say Claremont and Byrne. You said we could pick everything he said about Alpha Flight and everything, but classic X-Men stuff is there. The Danger Room, because Scott and Professor X understood they had to be sharp.
Mm-hmm.
They had to hone those powers. But the X-Men are also, everything in the West has strong categorical parameters. So if the Avengers are the cool kids, the X-Men are the outsider kids. And I have never agreed with those kinds of definitions. What do you do when you have multiple backgrounds? What do you do when you don't fit in a slot? And to me, the X-Men don't fit in that slot. People keep saying that you're this because you look like that, but the X-Men are the most human of all. They get it from every side. They get it from normies. They get it from fellow mutants. They get it from other teams. They get it from every side. And to speak to what Van said, the reason the danger is so real is because they're not invincible. So that is not exemplified in my mind any stronger than it is in the Claremont and Byrne run. To me, it's like sampled music. Most of the music that they sample is from the 20th century. The X-Men stories that they sample are the Claremont and Byrne stories more often than not. And those are the ones that they have mounted. And it's like aliens. They keep trying to imitate Dark Phoenix. Everybody's got to have a Dark Phoenix arc that comes from there. So, I mean, it's brilliant. It's groundbreaking. It flies in the face of all the rules. It shows you that, just because of how you look, you can save everyone and belong to no one. That doesn't happen with any other team. So it's just brilliant and it's layered, and I just love it.
Well, for me, I am one of those people that Van mentioned that you love most the thing that you fell in love with first. SG-1 will always be my Stargate. as awful as the art was, the John Forte and Edmund Hamilton Legion of Superheroes will always be my Legion of Superheroes. I'm just like that. But I really have to give a shout out to Teenie Howard's Excalibur, because it melds mutants and superpowers with magic and Arthurian legends. And there's nothing in there I don't love. And so I really enjoyed that book a lot. And then I just have to give a nod to Mr. and Mrs. X, which I wish had lasted longer, because I thought they did a good job of playing off Gambit and Rogue as a couple and giving them adventures that did not have to do with, oh, look, we're a couple. That's going to screw everything up. So I enjoyed that too. But everybody's mentioned Dark Phoenix. So why don't we just bite that bullet and talk about Dark Phoenix? So did you think it was good? Did you think it could have been done better? Did you hate it? And Van, I'm going to toss this hot potato into your lap first.
You mean the comic or the movie?
Well, let's talk about both of them.
Well, they did the movie twice, and it didn't really work either time. So that's that. The comic is interesting because I think the comic is where we really where we first came to understand that Claremont saw some of the X-Men as maybe really more important than others, and that he had very long range, bigger than life plans for some of them, if not others, because Scott and Jean and Logan become this trinity, this holy body in that storyline, and these doomed lovers and all that. I'm sure everybody else will have more interesting things to say about the story itself, but there's one thing I have. At DragonCon last year, I had a long conversation with Chris Claremont about this. And one of the things that he said was that if he had stayed on X-Men longer, and I was like, longer? But he said what he actually wanted to do was have them go all the way until the end of the universe and become like gods. And they were the last three beings left alive in the universe. And I'm like, half of me is shocked by that, and half of me is like, yeah, that fits. That's pretty much where he was going with them from the beginning, is they were the ones that mattered. Everybody else was there around them, but it was all about their little three-way relationship. So, but yeah, and I also think it's interesting that the Shi'ar played such an important role in that story, and we've yet to see them in any movie at all. And so I'm hoping that maybe that one of the things that we will get when we finally do get the X-Men in the Marvel Cinematic Universe is they can bring the Shi'ar in with them, and we can get Lilandra and the M'Kraan crystal and all the stuff that they've not ever really done at all in the X-Men movies. There's not a lot left that they haven't at least touched on in the X-Men movies, but anything to do with the Shi'ar and outer space and all, they haven't really done yet. And we know the MCU is not afraid to go there with outer space, far out stuff, right? They went there immediately. So yeah, that's kind of what I'm looking forward to.
Marisa?
Yeah, so I came to it late. It was already over. I think Claremont had already left the comics by the time I was reading, but I had no sense of time because I was, 10. So I went back and read them. I couldn't find them in order, so I was kind of reading them all over the place. I think I knew about Madeline Pryor before I got fully into the Dark Phoenix part. So it took me a while to work it out, but I loved the Hellfire Club. I loved all of the different layers. Like I loved Professor X versus Magneto, but I loved that there were all these different factions in the mutant world, because it just seemed like real to me. So I loved the idea that all this power, like Spider-Man, with all this power comes all this responsibility, but also all this temptation and corruption. And if you fall in with the wrong people, that can go whole new way. And I loved, even then, I was probably early teenager at that point, but the idea of a genuine good guy, like one of the first X-Men going bad, and then the other X-Men having to deal with it. I loved that part of the story. And so it felt like such a cheat. And I was like, just kidding. It was her clone. It's fine. She's great. So I didn't love that. But I think that was part of like a writer switch, wasn't it? Like that wasn't the plan. There was, I don't remember all the details of that, but I remember there was something I read later that I was like, Oh, that wasn't the plan.
Kurt Busiek came up with that later on and was kind of retconned in. You're right.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, great. That's helpful. Because I remember hating that. And I know like that's part of comics, right? Is the reinvention and no, now this is what really happened. Totally. But I love the corruption of a good guy and then their friends and loved ones having to deal with it. And then what happens, like the consequences of it. The trial with the Shi'ar was amazing. So I remember it feeling like it complicated the story in a way that I really loved. And in a way that honestly was probably one of the first, when I read Narnia and I found out at some point that it was an allegory for Christianity, I was like, what the heck? I was mad and I was insulted and I couldn't get over it for a really long time. But X-Men being an allegory for civil rights and then later for gay rights and then for just misfits in general, that always made sense to me. I was like, yeah, this checks out. I mean, white girl, suburban New England, like, you know, I wasn't super connected to any of those civil rights movements. But learning about them that way and thinking about like, okay, then what happens when somebody we love in real life, like we don't agree with their decisions, what do we do? I'm babbling a little bit, but I have a lot of feelings about Dark Phoenix, and we're not going to talk about the movies because they are trash. And I'm sad, but that's all.
Well, that's a very definite statement. Mike?
For Dark Phoenix, not for the movies. Okay, go ahead, Mike.
Yes.
You know, the interesting thing about Dark Phoenix is that Jean Grey, and after it was over in the comics, she felt, you know, of course, terrified about the power, you know, terrified of what happened with the entire civilization that was wiped away. But on the other side, it seems like the moniker of Dark Phoenix was something that she herself could never let go. You know, she, you know, for all of the fear of that power, of fear of becoming that again, she never really could herself disconnect herself from being Dark Phoenix. You know, her mannerisms, her costume, Dark Phoenix changed everything for Jean Grey as a character. You know, and whether she liked it or not, she was that character from then on out, even when she didn't have the power anymore. You know, that's what I found interesting about the run itself. Was, of course, it was masterful. You know, it was a dynamic shift in Jean Grey as a character. She was no longer the damsel in distress, even though she was probably one of the more powerful characters in the team. But, you know, she was the standout character for once. And it was an eye opener for a lot of comic book readers that this was a female standout character with so much power, you know, especially in the X book, because the X books were, you know, pretty macho at the time. You know, when Jean Grey blew up and became this all-encompassing force, you know, it moved a lot of people. And like I said, it probably changed the way everyone saw the character. Everyone saw the X-Men. I think a lot of people saw the X-Men differently after, you know, the Dark Phoenix saga. And me especially, I definitely saw the X-Men differently after Dark Phoenix saga. It felt like, oh, there were real stakes. You know, when that planet got wiped away, I was like, holy moly, that was serious. You know, they were serious. It felt like someone was going to die in a permanent way. You know, the stakes felt real for me in a comic book, like they never did before. But yeah, movies are trash.
Kat?
I think we are all agreed the movies are just flaming piles of a substance that we mentioned. Yeah, Dark Phoenix, she started as Marvel Girl, and she had kind of like such wimpy powers, right? Her powers was she could read minds, and that's, you know,
move dinner plates.
That's it. And then she started to be telekinetic, but then like she turned into Phoenix, and do you remember like that resurrection scene where she comes out of the water and she's just everybody thought she's dead and she just comes shooting out. And it's such a glorious moment. And I loved that. And I loved her like becoming powerful. And then there was this like, but she's evil, you know? And I was just like, fuck. I mean,
Stole it.
So that was how I felt about that. We'll leave it at that.
Yeah.
Here was the thing that when I first saw that Dark Phoenix arc, and I think if you're going to be into comics, you gotta love mythology. And the first thought I had when you saw that was it was almost the death, ascension, rebirth arc where somebody is invested with the power of basically becoming a demigod. And it was looking at somebody who was already more than just human, but having that investment. It was almost that, okay, we're going to take you up and make you a full goddess. And it was but it wasn't just, okay, here I am, I'm a shining beacon. It was a goddess of rage and power. And all of a sudden it was very much that trip, and that strength was, again, kind of that same thing I liked from the Noir series. It was that idea of you can't always control power, and how we respond to it as people is always one of those things. Is how do we respond if somebody gives you power or responsibility or whatever the case may be, and especially when that power is coming not entirely from you and yourself, when it's coming from another being. I mean, it was almost possession by a god that made her, that created the Dark Phoenix. And that to me was to watch that conflict of personalities and that baggage coming along of, okay, yeah, we can wipe out a planet. And all of that packaged up into somebody who was already damaged and having enough problems with having the power she had. The ability to read minds. I mean, just, we all kind of, oh yeah, I'd love to be able to read minds. But when you think about it for any length of time, that would drive you mad unless you really learn to control it. So you've got to figure this is somebody who was already teetering, and now you're going to amp that up by however many factors. I mean, it was just one of those things that was beautifully done. And you both felt for it. And all of a sudden it was like, all right, oh, this is not going to be pretty. And that was just a beautiful story. It wasn't, we're going to amp you up so you can go fight the next tier bad guy. It was, no, we're going to amp you up, and now you've got to deal with the consequences.
David?
Holy cow. Okay, I'm going to have to try to truncate my comments because I have much. First of all, I understand it might be a stereotype or archetype. I understand the Jean Grey type. She was that girl in the band that all the guys are in love with, and she don't know it. And she was vulnerable like that. And how can you be that when you're a telepath? That always just messed with my mind. Professor X love you, Scott love you, Bobby love you, Warren love you. She's like, la, 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 la. So she was definitely demure and reserved and just not aggressive and not obtrusive and not rude. And she can reach out with her mind, and she wouldn't be rude that way. She's that girl. What happens when you introduce a whole new level of thing? And I still maintain, we call her Dark Phoenix. She didn't really get dark until later, because a lot of this stuff that happened, it was a spectrum. It was a different way of living. Jason Wingard, Mastermind, was helping you wild out, go to wild parties, see the world in a different way, different experiences, because she was kind of straight-laced. That's not dark. That's just different. It gets dark when she's the planet. Okay, then I was just like, Mike, with that, I'm like, okay, somebody got to die now. Because that was a point of no return decision.
No return. Yep, no return.
Come back from that. That has to be answered. Well, forget it. Just shut the comic book down. So when we see her go along that spectrum, the question then becomes, what happens if you get a taste of a life that's different from the life you've had before? Because that's not dark yet. That's just different. And then, see, her love for Scott was pure. They did the psychic rapport. They did the psychic bond. I'm in your head, you're in mine. That means you can't have nothing else running around up in there. You don't want your significant other to know if you're going to do that. Their love was pure. That's why I've always loved them. So when you take a character like that and you take her all the way to this bondage, crazy, angry, plan and consuming, it's like, holy cow. And it was at the time where we didn't see that kind of progression of those kinds of stakes. And so that's why I think it was so groundbreaking and impactful, because of who she was and where they took her to. And then you have to ask yourself, if I was tempted with a different lifestyle, that kind of power, if I could elevate to that kind of level, how would I respond to that? And that's what made her journey so relatable. And then on top of all that, the Shire Imperial Guard, Marvel's Legion of Superheroes. I love the Legion of Superheroes. Holy cow. So I can't get enough of the Imperial Guard. Everyone, I love every one of them. Can't get enough of them. So introducing that, and again, that's when it escalated to the point where Lilandra was like, no, we understand what this Phoenix thing is, and she didn't kill a billion people. She ate them like a 2-piece, with a side of your fries and a biscuit, and said, no. This must be. I know how much y'all love her, but this is a different level. This is not just your family anymore. This the universe. And that's why we're just breathless watching that whole thing. And then when we get through all that, Jean understands, because I think what Mike said was really, really interesting about never fully shedding the Phoenix mantle from that point forward. But Jean understood in the first story in X-Men 137 that I have to kill myself. I can't go on like this. I can't contain this power. I can't contain my passions anymore. They're awake, and I can't go back to who I was. And if I stay in that state, I'm going to kill people. So I'd rather kill me, which lets me know she went all the way evil.
Yes.
If you were all the way evil, you would have indulged in that, not look back the same way Lex Luthor does. That ain't what Jean did. And then, on top of all that, for Scott to stand there in front of her ashes, and they're screaming each other's name as she dies. Holy cow. You wish you had somebody loved you like this. You, Scott, you wish you had a Jean. If you, Jean, you wish you had a Scott in your life. That's how powerful that was on the page. Now, in terms of the movies, the reason that the movies fail is because you can't do that story in 2 hours. Like you're trying to tell
No, you can't.
That was a story that built up over a year plus. And you have to know who Jean is when we start for Dark Phoenix to have any impact at all. And you can't do that. We spent no time with Sophie Turner's Jean, and Famke's Jean was not her, not that. So the last thing I'll say, because we could do an hour on this, the last thing I'll say is I just tweeted about it. I can't stand it when they Dawson, Joey, and Pacey some characters.
Yeah.
Don't ever bring me in on Jean and Logan, because I can't stand them.
Yeah.
I cannot stand Jean with Logan. I can't stand them as a throuple, whatever you want to call them. I can't stand them. I can't stand the sight of them. Because very rarely do you find someone that love each other like Scott and Jean did, and here come Logan. Out of all the women in the world you could have, you got to set your sights on her. Yeah, okay, whatever.
Yeah.
So so I can't stand them. Can't stand them. So when you do that Dawson's Creek triangle, what happens is you close off all the other story possibilities, and now it's about will they or won't they, who she gonna pick.
Yeah.
And they're bigger than that. And I'm gonna just leave that right there.
David,
can I add real quick though, because something that David brought up, just real quick, is that you mentioned that she destroyed the planet, and that was it. What happened, for those that don't know, Jim Shooter had become editor-in-chief and was trying to really crack down on things, on continuity and all. And Claremont and Byrne had not planned to kill her. They were going to have her get out of it at the last second. And Jim Shooter said, you had her kill everybody on the planet. You can't have her get away with this. And they're like, oh, well, we wouldn't have done that if we'd known that. He's like, well, it's too late now. It's already been published. You got to kill her. And so they spent the next 20 years trying to undo what they had to do because of the editor said, no, you got to.
Oh.
So that was fair.
Yep.
Darryl?
Oh boy, wow. First of all, I'd like to state for the record that the movies are trash. I don't know if we brought that up yet or not. Most of the good stuff has been touched on, I think, by everybody else. I agree with Marisa that I love the dismantling and the fall of a great character. Like that's nothing more delicious to me in storytelling than a tragic hero. It always makes for great storytelling. I think Dark Phoenix, I casually mentioned it in the beginning. I think that Dark Phoenix is when I realized that the X-Men really is the greatest soap opera the world has ever seen.
Yes. It absolutely is.
Yeah, a multi-generational soap opera is what the X-Men have become. Far better than General Hospital is. what we get out of the Dark Phoenix is just one of the greatest progressions of character. What David was just talking about with Jean still having that modicum of good in her at the very core is something I didn't realize until decades later when they revisited it with Avengers versus X-Men, and you saw just how quickly everyone who got that Phoenix Force corrupted. Scott, who had front row seats to what it did to Jean, you know, he broke bad. I think Emma broke bad. Aquaman, I'm sorry, Namor broke bad. Like all those Colossus and Magic broke bad. It ate them up from the inside out, and it wasn't until I read that I realized just how what Jean had to go through and how wild it was altogether. It is one of the greatest arcs in comic book storytelling, I think.
Well, I was in my first out of school job when that issue came out. And I couldn't wait to read it because I had this feeling that things weren't going to come out well for Jean and Scott. And so on my lunch break, I went to, this is when you still bought comic books at drugstores. Mm-hmm. I went to the drugstore and bought the comic book and sat in my car and read it and wept because it was such that moment that David was talking about. Scott realizes that Jean's going to kill herself. And she says to him, if I don't do this, I have to be in control for every minute of the rest of my immortal life, and I'm hanging on by my fingernails. I've remembered that all these years. And I think one reason that part of X-Men The Last Stand doesn't work as well is that you don't have the emotional stakes for the characters because you have this lifelong love of Scott and Jean, and you see what this is doing to him. Now, granted, Hugh Jackman is a much bigger star than James Marsden, who gets off at the beginning of the movie. Mm-hmm. But I think the relationship stakes, the personal stakes, are not as high in the movie. And I think they took one of the best comic book stories I've ever read, and I say that as a proponent of happy endings, and wrecked it. They didn't do it justice. They would have done better to leave it alone. We seem to be at consensus about the movies, but everybody had kind of touched on the story. And so I thought, well, this is why the movie for me, especially that movie, didn't work, because that story in the comic book had really just grabbed my heartstrings and wrenched. And it was not set up to do that in the structure of the movie story. So for me, that's why I didn't like it as well.
To me, that was the reason. That was the reason that movie was trash, was because they killed Scott at the beginning of it.
Yep.
It was almost you got the sensation of she killed him so he wouldn't have to see her do what she was going to do. And I'm like, but that's the story.
Yeah.
They are the story. And so you took half of it out and it's like, what are you doing here? I mean, they are the story. And that to me was what killed that entire film, was they took that part of the story out up front.
Yeah. Well, I mean, for me, Jean and Logan is like, what are you talking about? And Scott and Emma is, what are you talking about? It's just
agreed.
Yeah. Does anybody, we're actually coming up on time. Does anybody else want to weigh in on any last thing? Marisa, we'll start with you.
Oh man, Kat's ready. I'm gonna think. Go for it, Kat. Can't we?
I just want to say that I think David is right. He said that the movies are just too short, and I think the X-Men, like, they would make an amazing mini series, perhaps.
Yeah.
If they get their pacing under control.
Yeah.
The thing, I have so many thoughts about so many X-Men, I cannot be brief. So the thing that I am taking from tonight's conversation, and I am so pleased, is Dawson and Pacey as a verb. Thank you, David. It is the best thing that has ever happened. Like, come on, man, that's amazing. So I think X-Men, it's the relationships with the people and how they grapple with their power and how they are seen. And the movies shortchange that a lot. I liked a lot of the movies. We didn't even get to talk about Age of Apocalypse, which is an amazing comic run, I think. In the movie, I was like, okay, I see what you're doing. Okay. We should just do X-Men every week. Let's just do that.
Mike?
I have something that since we're coming up on the top of the hour, I have something that I would like to share with everybody. If I can share my screen real quick. So this is what I wanted to, if everyone can see the screen.
Wow.
Mhm.
This is what I wanted to share with you guys. This is, if you guys know the Marvel Universe Online project that I work on, it's an alternate version of the Marvel Universe, of course. And of course, within that is an alternate version of the X-Men. Particularly Jean Grey has gone through, as you can see in these images, has gone through some changes. There was a war that caused Charles Xavier to lose his life, and in his passing triggered Jean Grey to lose her telekinetic abilities while fighting, while in the air. And the irony of it had put her in the same chair that he used to be in. So that's our version of Jean Grey of Earth 619.
Oh, okay.
Cool.
Yeah.
Cool.
And as such, occasionally under concentration and stress, she can become the Phoenix again with her full abilities once again. So that I thought for this particular panel, I could share this little bit of lore that we're working on right now. I thought you guys would get a kick out of it.
Pretty dope.
Awesome.
Very cool.
Very nice.
All right.
And I do have to say that, yes, Dave Cockrum was a costuming genius, and he redid the Legion of Superheroes to great effect as well. But I think the green Phoenix costume is one of the most beautiful superhero costumes I have ever
Yes.
seen.
Without question.
Agreed.
So
Yeah.
pretty.
Jim, what?
Well, I think we also boiled this down to something here is that realistically, this does not need to be a miniseries. This just needs to go ahead and be a soap opera a la Dark Shadows.
Yeah.
You know, so every day a half an hour.
Yes.
But they cannot skimp on the budget. I cannot stress this enough. We are in an era now where, $50 million an episode is normal. They cannot skimp on the budget for the effects, the costumes, the scenery. Everything has to be top notch. I refuse to accept that. I refuse to accept that HBO is the only one that knows how to spend money on these action adventure television series.
Marisa,
I'm coming back to you like I threatened to.
Oh no, I jumped in. Age of Apocalypse. I want to talk about X-Men every week. I want to talk about time travel and all the different permutations of X-Men. I want it to be a soap opera that goes as long as General Hospital has gone. I fully co-sign all of this.
Okay. Darryl?
Something that I want to talk about that Van had touched briefly on is, Van, I think you said something to the effect of the Avengers are like the rock stars accepted by everybody, but the X-Men are hated and feared. And it's kind of why I love the X-Men. Captain America can step out onto a Brooklyn street and just be looking all handsome and charming. And Reed Richards, if he chooses not to stretch, can just be a guy who goes to the store, whereas you got Glob Herman, where you can see his insides all day long. It's a different kind of deal. Or you have a guy with giant wings sticking out of his back, or a blue dude over here. It's a different kind of thing, and it forced humanity to ask the question of, is this something we can coexist with? And for a good number of people, that answer was no. And it kind of shows you through the X-Men some of the worst of humanity. And one thing I've always said about great science fiction is that the great science fiction is used as a lens to mirror our reality, our current state. And through the X-Men, they have shown multiple times just how awful human beings can be. And that's another part of the reason why I love this team so much. And through all of the hate they get, both within and without, they always continue to endure.
Yeah.
Van?
Well, that makes me actually, Darryl, think of something else to say here, which is that when they do incorporate them into the MCU in the days to come, which we know they will, they're going to have to come up with some way to differentiate the X-Men and the mutants from the existing Marvel characters, because in the comics, we understand that the X-Men are mutants because we're told over and over in the comics, and we see they're in a different comic book from the other ones. They're in the X-Men comics, whatever. But there's honestly no functional difference between. In fact, I would argue that the Thing is more of a mutant than Colossus, because Colossus can change into a normal guy. The Thing is stuck as the Thing, and yet the Thing goes outside and he's a rock star.
Yeah.
And Colossus goes outside and he goes, die muty scum.
Now, if I can jump in real quick on that. Now, you have to remember too, Bolivar Trask literally pulled a Sean Hannity and got on television and literally told people why they should hate the X-Men, why they should hate mutants and not hate all of the other super people. They gave them a reason to differentiate between mutants and every other superpower person. Said they are going to replace you.
Oh boy.
Everyone else's powers were accidents given to, bestowed upon them. These are your replacements. They're coming to replace your children. So if you're going to do that, that's what you need to do. You need to bring that kind of person on television to tell the masses, here's why you need to hate these people.
Well, but I think
that's another word for you, Marissa, by the way.
But I still think that that's kind of the core of it, which is you've got people who obtain powers because of, in essence, tragedy.
Yeah.
Generally. I mean, it wasn't that, somebody came over and said, here's your birthday present. It was, these are people that were born. Yeah. And it was the differentiation between somebody that, you had to suffer through this, so now you're a hero because you're working past it, versus you were born like this, you're just screwed. And, we're afraid that because you were born this way, you're going to be the next generation of humanity, which means that you're then replacing who we are. It's the same standard fear thing. And it's that balance of powers given versus powers born. And I think that is the core reason for the power of the entire series.
David, did you want to wind up?
Yeah, I'm wound up, but I'll be brief. First thing I want to say is what Van said. You got to remember that is how they reacted to Ben. They hated Ben. They were afraid of Ben. Ben was very angry, very mopey. He had on his trench coat and all that. So that is not how Ben started. Mm-hmm. What happened with the Fantastic Four is they saved the world in public more than once. They earned that rock star status. That's the difference, because people saw them as saviors of the planet. They're like, oh, okay, well, this rock guy must be kind of cool. He's part of that team. So there's that. Oh, Lord, I think I froze. Okay, so that's number one. Number two, see, it's that Joss Whedon putting the wrong people together thing, like Natasha and Bruce. See, Emma should have been with Logan.
Yeah, I
should have been with Wolverine.
See that.
Y'all deserve each other. Leave Scott and Pete alone.
I could have gotten behind that. Yeah.
Last thing I'll say about, we have this phrase, Magneto was right.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to understand the power behind that phrase, the reason that we keep counting Magneto as a villain is only because he's proactive. The way Western people think is your enemy has to hurt you first, and then you are justified in using retaliatory force on whatever level you want, as long as somebody in your camp died first. Magneto thinks differently. Magneto thinks, I'm not going to wait till they take us out. And so that's the moral conflict that makes X-Men so interesting. Because Charles was like, well, we're going to attempt to live in peace. And Magneto was like, they're going to take y'all out as fast as they can and put you in camps and put collars on you. And Charles was like, nah, it'll be fine. And sure enough, here come the Sentinels. And Magneto was like, did I tell y'all? So that's the brilliance of the way they make us face how we process our moral frames. Because that really is what we think. As long as you don't do the first strike, you're still a good person. That means somebody in your camp got to die. Then when they kill somebody in your camp, then you feel justified in being as crazy as you want. Magneto said, we're going to skip the middleman.
Mm-hmm. Go directly to
right. They ain't putting no more collars on me because I had enough of that, and whatever. And so again, they're just brilliant. And I agree with what everybody says. We need this on our TV screens on the regular. This would be bigger than anything if it's written right. and budget it right, like Mike said, this would be bigger than anything on TV. A weekly X-Men show, you've got to be kidding me. So we got to make it happen now.
Let's do it.
Okay, well, on that note, I think we'll have to wind up because we're running on time. So we'll go around and everybody tell people where they can find you. And if you have a recent or upcoming release you want to mention, please feel free to do that. And Mike, we'll start with you.
Well, as everyone knows, you can find me on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, the Marvel Universe Online website, www.themarveluniverseonline.com. That is our pitch deck, and it is constantly evolving, and the world of Earth 619 is as fascinating a version of the Marvel Universe as any other, and I hope everyone can come in and check it out and enjoy what we're doing.
Okay, Kat?
Well, you can find me on the Twitters as Kat Rambo and in most social media and under that name. I urge you to check out my space opera, You Sexy Thing. And then I've also got an anthology co-edited with Jen Brozek called The Reinvented Heart. And I think this is my last con appearance for 2022. So look for me online. That's where I usually am.
Okay, Jim?
Easiest thing is find me at jamespnettles.com, authoressentials.net, authoressentialsworkshops.com, Speculative Fiction Academy, and here, ConTinual. Guess they never let me go.
David?
On the Twitters, I am DT2 Comics Chat. If you want to follow everything I'm doing, that's my home website. It's davidtaylor2, the number 2.net. And let me see, Kat, I just followed you, by the way. And the project I have coming up is a project called Blood World, where it's 6 different stories by 6 different authors about a future Earth, and it's incredible. Can't wait for you guys to see it, so stay tuned for that.
Darryl?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter doing my usual film critic thing at Seedalicious, SEEDALICIOUS. And you can find all my reviews and whatnot on paprikareviews.com, POPRIKA, like paprika with an O instead of an A. Always new reviews and whatnot coming out. We have the horror movie draft dropping at the end of the month for all you scary movie fans. So that should be a good time. Good time.
Okay, Marisa?
MarisaWolf.net, MarisaWolf.com. If you like books and you like dogs, on Instagram, I'm at BookDogs. I mostly use Twitter to scream into the void, so I recommend Instagram. But for recent releases, if you like urban fantasy and well-rounded lady protagonists, the Valkyries Initiative just came out. It is an anthology with 15 stories that kicks off a whole new storyline of badass chicks being badass and getting to be whole people, which is super fun. And so that's out right now.
Okay, Van?
I just want to say that the thing I'm taking away from this hour of fun with you guys is that I want to read a David Taylor written X-Men comic now. But,
Yes.
Let's make it so.
Let's do it. Let's do it. My most recent new book this summer is Validus V, a novel of giant robots and giant monsters, which is basically my love letter to Herb Trimpe and Doug Munch from back in the 70s with Godzilla and the Shogun Warriors. So you can find that on Amazon. You can find all my podcasts, everything else at www.plexico.net, and I'm on Twitter at Van Allen Plexico. So there's where you can find me, guys, right there.
Nice.
Boom.
Well, you can find me here at ConTinual. You can find further information at nancynorthcott.com. I spend more time on Twitter than is probably good for me, and I'm at Nancy Northcott there. My latest book is actually a paranormal romance because I like superheroes, but I thought mages would be easier to deal with. And that's called Embattled Mage, and it's the 4th in a series. So I'd like to thank everybody on the panel for joining this discussion. It's been great. Thank you to our sponsors, Heroes Aren't Hard to Find and Heroes Convention. For more information about them, you can visit www.heroesonline.com. Thank you.